Hi, everyone. My name is Shalhevet Schwartz, and we're back with Gefet on Daf Yomi, a joint project of Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha. The sugya that we'll be exploring today, or really the halakhic concept that we'll be exploring today, which shows up on our daf, is Zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. Um, the idea that someone can benefit on behalf of somebody else, even not in that person's presence, and even without that person's explicit consent. So, if someone owes me money, someone else can, let's say, collect the loan on my behalf, and then the money becomes mine via their kinyan of the money that is done for me, or someone can, pick up a check for me, or as long as the transaction or the action itself that is being done on my behalf is unambiguously good for me. Someone can do it even without asking my explicit permission first, or even without my explicit appointment of it. That's the concept. Shows up on today's daf, and what we'll be exploring today is a kind of conceptual exploration of this institution of zachin ladam shelo b'fanav, and via its relationship to another halachic concept, the concept of shlichut. It often pays when trying to understand a deen or a halachic concept to take a look at other halachic institutions or other halachic concepts that seem similar in some ways to the one that we're trying to understand, to see and to do a little bit of comparative work and to understand, okay, to what degree are these actually related? Is one a subset of the other? Is one a kind of subcategory of the other? Are they in some ways two sides of the same coin, or are they actually more or less different? And what we'll be looking at today are a couple of different, primarily via Shitat Tosafot, but also via a couple of different rishonim, trying to understand the relationship between Zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav and the halachic concept of Shelichut, through which I can appoint someone to do some kind of action, or make some kind of kinyan on my behalf. So let's get started with the mishnah. The mishnah on today's daf, in which the concept of zachin appears. We're in the context of a discussion of a shliv, right? A person who is on his deathbed, and whether or not he can declare his intentions about his will verbally rather than writing it down. So Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shabbat, Rav Kayamim, Mipnei she'ein yachol lichtov, right, on Shabbat, because he can't write, a shliv can make a will verbally. Of Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Shabbat amru kal v'chomer b'chol. And Rabbi Yehoshua says actually the only reason it works on Shabbat is because it also could have worked in Chol. This less li'inyanenu. So, but we see that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua have a similarly framed machloket, not about the shliv, but about zachin. So the Mishnah continues, kayotzebo, zachin lekatan ve'in zachin legadol, divrei Rabbi Eliezer, right? Someone else can be zocheh on behalf of a katan, but not a gadol, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Whereas Rabbi Yehoshua believes not the opposite deen, but the opposite logic. Lekatan amru kal v'chomer legadol, right? Both agree that zachin lekatan. And Rabbi Eliezer thinks that zachin lakatan to the exclusion of a gadol, because right, there's some reason why zachin lakatan can work, but not for a gadol. Whereas Rabbi Yehoshua says, actually, no, a gadol is more obvious, and the fact that zachin lakatan means that obviously also zachin lagadol. So the Rashbam explains why, according to this mishnah, zachin lakatan ve'in zachin lagadol, according to Rabbi Eliezer, and explains the opposite logic as well. So zachin lakatan, according to the Rashbam, why? Ho'il ve'ein lo yad lizkot la'atzmo mamon shenotnim lo tiknu chachamim sheyehei acher zocheh u'mekabel etzorcha. Right? That a katan who is not considered a bar dad, is not considered to be able to really make his own economic transactions. So that's the reason why tiknu chachamim, right? Why Chazal made a takana that other people can do it on his behalf. He can't do it by himself, so other people can do it for him. Whereas ein zachin lagadol sheharei yachol lizkot b'atzmo, right? A gadol can do it on his own, so why would he need someone else to do it for him? There's no reason for Chazal to make such a takana. That's Shitat Rabbi Eliezer. Shitat Rabbi Yehoshua is the opposite. Shitat Rabbi Yehoshua is katan amru mishum dezachin lo shelo b'fanav, right? That zachin lekatan works via this broader concept of zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, right? That in general, there's a principle of zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, that and v'kol sheken hagadol sheyesh lo yad lekabel v'lizkot, v'shaliach nami matzi mashvi, right? That, and the Rashbam here already is connecting the principle of zachin to the principle of shlichut, right? Just like with shlichut, I can appoint someone to do something on my behalf, and I can only appoint someone to do something on my behalf if I could have done it myself. So too, zachin, no one's appointing anyone, and no one's appointing anything, but someone can do something on my behalf based on the fact that I could have also done it on my own. And if that's true, that makes it more obvious that zachin should work with a gadol rather than with a katan. A katan couldn't have done it on his own. So the fact that we know that you can do zachin with a katan, right, means that it must also be the case that zachin works for a gadol. The Gemara on this mishnah, though, notes that there are actually two different versions of this mishnah in which the shitot are flipped, or almost flipped. Right, Matnitin Mani Rabbi Yehuda. So this mishnah that we have on our daf, the mishnah in Bava Batra, is Aliba de Rabbi Yehuda. This is Rabbi Yehuda's version of that mishnah, right? Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir have a machloket about the machloket Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, who said what. So, Rabbi Yehuda's version of the Mishnah is almost exactly what we saw, but we're going to see, Titania, we're bringing the other version of the Mishnah, Rabbi Meir's version of the Mishnah, in which the shitot are more or less flipped. According to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, skip the whole Shabbat, Kayotsebo, I'm on the fourth line there, Kayotsebo, Zachin gadol ve'in zachin katan, divrei Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua Omer, begadol amru, kal v'chomer bekatan. So Rabbi Meir's version of the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua agree not that zachin katan. The question is that to the exclusion of a gadol, or is that kal v'chomer gadol? Rather, they agree that zachin gadol, and the question is zachin gadol to the exclusion of a katan or kal v'chomer katan. So we still have a machloket Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua about which is more obvious, katan or gadol. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Meir, zachin legadol exclude zachin legadol and not a katan, whereas according to Rabbi Yehoshua, zachin legadol and kal v'chomer lekatan. So just to map out the shitot, according to Rabbi Meir's Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer thinks zachin works for a gadol, not a katan. Rabbi Yehoshua thinks zachin works for both, but that the fact that it works for a gadol, kal v'chomer to a katan, aka it's more obvious that it works for a katan than for a gadol. According to Rabbi Yehuda's Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer thinks zachin legadol v'lo lekatan. And Rabbi Yehoshua, who still thinks zachin works both for a gadol and a katan, thinks that the kal v'chomer is in the other direction. The fact that zachin works for a katan means kal v'chomer that it works for a gadol. Tosafot here tries to basically explain shitat Rabbi Eliezer according to both Rabbi Meir's opinion and according to both Rabbi Meir's Mishnah and according to Rabbi Yehuda's Mishnah. And what emerges out of this Tosafot is going to be what I would call a kind of further elaboration of the relationship between zachin and shlichut, and he really gives us two different ways of understanding. According to Rabbi Eliezer, everyone thinks it works for one but not the other, and the question is, which does he think it works for? The relationship between zachin and shlichut. So, right, according to Rabbi Eliezer, according to the opinion that thinks that zachin legadol v'lo lekatan, which is to say, Mishnah Rabbi Meir. So v'im tomar, Tosafot asks, v'im tomar lama im zachin lekatan, halo zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, right? If I am Rabbi Eliezer, and I think that zachin legadol v'lo zachin lekatan, Tosafot takes a second and asks why. Don't we know that broadly speaking, zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, or shouldn't we say that zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav yesh lomar the kevan de zechiyah mitam shlichut, Man dematzi mashvi shaliach yesh lo zechiyah. Uman delo matzi mashvi shaliach ein lo zechiyah. Right? This is similar to what the way that the Ramban explained the Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion actually earlier, explained the kal v'chomer in the other direction. So it's there he was explaining why Zachin Gadol is more obvious than Zachin Katan, according to the opinion that learns a kal v'chomer. Here he's explaining also why Zachin Gadol is more obvious than Zachin Katan, but according to the opinion that thinks that Zachin Gadol works and Zachin Katan does not. That because Zichiyah, right, Zachin Adam Shelo B'fanav really is a subcategory of Shlichut. So now what's the relationship between Zachin and Shlichut? Zachin really is a subcategory of Shlichut, and therefore it should operate according to the same principles as Shlichut. Right. So the kind of person or the set of people who can appoint a Shaliach are also the set of people for whom Zachin can work. Right. If you think about what the relationship between Zachin and Shlichut, according to this model, usually, right, Shlichut involves what? I have to appoint a Shaliach. There's a minui that is required. But Zachin may, and we'll see this kind of elaborated more explicitly in a different Tosafot in a moment, seems to be really just Shlichut that for some reason does not require that minui, does not require that appointment of a Shaliach. And presumably because if it's obviously for my benefit, there's some kind of implicit or assumed consent or assumed appointment almost that can happen even without my explicitly doing it. But it would still, but because Zachin really is just a kind of Shlichut, it should only apply in the cases where Shlichut can apply. Now he tries to explain Rabbi Eliezer in the other direction, meaning Rabbi Eliezer according to Mishnah Rabbi Yehuda. So man itle Zachin lekatan ve'ein Zachin legadol. Right. So if you think that Zachin works for a katan but not for a gadol, svirely kevan de gadol yachol liknot lo tikun le Rabbanan zechia kimo bekatan. So also kind of a similar explanation to that of the Rashbam earlier, but maybe even a little bit more explicit, right? If I think that Zachin lekatan works, but Zachin legadol does not, it's because the fact that a gadol is able to do it himself, right? There's no reason to make a takana de Rabbanan of zichiyah. According to this logic, really, I would have to understand, and according to Rabbi Eliezer, according to the Rabbi Yehuda, really, I would have to understand zichiyah lekatan as a takana de Rabbanan, made for kind of it that is instituted specifically for the kind of case in which I myself cannot act, or I myself, and the fact that a katan is not able to be mashve shaliach, the fact that a katan is not able to be kona things on his own, is dafka a reason why this takana would take effect, rather than a reason why Zachin should be impossible. So just the explanation of Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Meir's Mishnah, right, that Zachin works for an adult but not for a child, right, is because Zachin functions as a subcategory of Shlichut, and therefore all the same rules should apply. Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda's Mishnah, where Zachin, according to Rabbi Eliezer, works for a child but not for an adult, right, we have to understand Zachin as a rabbinic takana meant dafka for a place where it says here Shlichut is impossible, but here in Tosafot where the katan's kinyan on his own is impossible. But if we take something of Tosafot's logic here about zichiyah of a katan as a takana de Rabbanan, we can even really explain it according to the same logic that sees Zachin as a sort of sniff off or a sort of branch off of Shlichut, right? According to Rabbi Meir, it really is just Shlichut without the minui, and therefore should work obviously according to those principles. Whereas if we see it as a kind of derabanan Shlichut that can almost be set up for the kind of situation in which Shlichut itself can't come into effect. So really just quickly to map out what we've seen thus far about the relationship between Zachin and Shlichut, more or less, right? Zachin, if someone does something on my behalf, Shlichut, same thing. Zachin, it can only apply to cases where something is obviously for my benefit. Whereas shlichut, like I can be mimoneh shaliach, whether it's good for me or bad for me. Zachin does not require minui, right? Even if zachin, as we saw in Tosafot, is a kind of subcategory of shlichut, it's shlichut without the minui, whereas shlichut itself requires minui. And zachin can occur without my presence. We know that shlichut doesn't, that a child cannot be mimoneh shaliach. Shlichut does not work with a katan. We can see further a little bit more of an elucidation of exactly what according to Tosafot, who ultimately, right, before we saw Tosafot explaining the difference between, or explaining the logic of Rabbi Eliezer according to the different shitot, because we end up seeing Zachin Ladam Shelo B'fanav as a principle all over Shas that does apply to a gadol, right? So we know that Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is not ultimately how we paskin, which means that Tosafot does end up poskening that, right, that Zachin is mita'am shlichut and should therefore work according to the rules of shlichut. But what happens? We also see that Zachin works for a katan. And we saw that if Zachin really is mita'am shlichut, then theoretically it shouldn't work for a katan. So Tosafot is going to address this and I think give us even further details into what Zachin is and what its relationship is to Shelichut via a sugya in Ketubot, in which we see that Zachin works for a katan. So we see it in the context of a ger, someone who is a ger katan, a katan who is converting. Amar Rav Huna ger katan bilino al dat beitin, right? The beitin can decide to convert a child, even though the child isn't old enough yet to consent. My kanash malan, what's this coming to teach us? That actually being part of the Jewish people is a zchut for this child. V'zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. Okay, so we see zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav from this memory of Rav Huna, and we see it specifically with a katan. So now Tosafot wonders what to do with this. V'tema dehaz zechia have a mita'am shlichut. Tosafot says, right, look, we see Zechia is mitam shlichut. And just like I explained in Shitat Rabbi Eliezer, Livid Rabbi Meir before. And now, right, Tosafot gives us actually a little bit more, even a further kind of conceptual elaboration of, right, it basically is shlichut, it's shlichut without the minui. And why don't we need the minui, according to Tosafot? Because the fact that it is obviously good for him, the fact that it is a zechut means that anan sahade, literally we are the witnesses, but that it's a kind of publicly obvious truth, de avid le shaliach, that the minui of the shaliach, or the fact that this beit din, let's say, is a shaliach for the katan, functions via, right, this principle of anan sahade. That's how Zachin works. Zachin just is shlichut, but minus the minui. But if that's the case, Tosafot wonders, why should it work for a katan? We saw that as an explanation of Rabbi Eliezer, who said it works for a gadol, but not for a katan. So v'im came, hey, ach zachin lekatan, v'halo ein shlichut lekatan. So if zachin really just is shlichut without the minui via anan sadeh, well then if shlichut can't work, then, which we know it can't for a katan, then how can zachin work? The Yael. So Tosafot's answer. And here is where what he ultimately comes out to is, on some level, something that looks kind of like a compromise position between the two positions that he presented earlier. Right, that here with the katan, zachin lo midirabanan. Right, because ha'ate liklal shlichut. So he's quoting a sugya in Bava Metzia, which asks specifically this question about why should Zachin work for a katan if shlichut doesn't, and it explains that one day this katan is going to grow up and is going to be he is going to be a bar da'at, and theoretically shlichut could work, will one day work for this katan, and therefore we say that Zachin is possible for a katan. According to the that Zachin for a katan is Zachin midirabanan, right? Theoretically, Zachin really is just a not a cousin of shlichut, but really a subcategory of shlichut, a way that shlichut can work, or a mechanism through which shlichut can work without a minui. But because of anan sahide, but because with a katan right now doesn't have the capacity to be a shaliach, there's a takana d'Rabbanat that we can do Zachin even for a katan. Right, so that Zachin for a katan operates as this takana d'Rabbanan specifically for the case where it wouldn't necessarily work on its own if it had to operate according to, right, as bona fide shlichut according to the principles of shlichut. So what we see on the one hand is that Zachin really is a subcategory of shlichut. On the other hand, that there's an element of a takana d'Rabbanan that specifically allows us to employ Zachin in places where shlichut wouldn't normally operate, based on the fact that one day for this katan, shlichut will be able to operate. Now, this whole shita of Tosafot, that Zachin really does land us right squarely in the world of shlichut, is going to be made trickier by a sugya in kiddushin. Right, the sugya in kiddushin is trying to find a makor for the deen of shlichut, right? If trying to figure out right shlichut minela, and that's the sugya in kiddushin. And they offer one option from the or Rav Gidel Amar says in the name of Rav offers one option from the psukim about nachalat haaretz, right? Minayin ela had Amar Rav Gidel Amar Rav minayin shlichut shel adam k'moto. How do we know that shlichut shel adam k'moto? Shene Amar v'nasiach had mimateh. So that hanchalat haaretz happened via the nesiim, which was one per shevet, and one person per shevet was ultimately being nochel that portion of the land for in all of Bnei, or all of that shevet of Bnei Israel. So we can learn shlichut from there. The Gemara has a problem with this limud because there are also ktanim involved in hanchalat haaretz, right? Ktanim also inherit the land, but how could they do that if they can't be memaneh shaliach? So clearly, the mechanism that is operating here can't be shlichut. Ella, the Rava bar Huna, the Amar Rava bar Huna, Amar Gidol Amar Rav. So we have actually a different version of this memra of Rav Gidol in the name of Rav, which is that we're not learning shlichut, we're learning something else. Minayin shed zachin l'adam shelo b'fanav. What's this something else that we're learning? It's zachin. How do we know that zachin l'adam shelo b'fanav? Shne'emar v'nasiach ad nasiach ad. So we don't have to worry about the katan problem because we're not talking about shlichut, we're talking about zachin. And what's going on in hanchalat haaretz isn't that anyone was explicitly being memaneh shaliach, but rather that the nesiim were being koneh the land, right? We're being nochel the land on behalf of Bnei Israel, which is a zichiyah for them, and therefore it should work for the gedolim and also for the ketanim. Then we end up the Gemara ends up rejecting that because we're at the question of really whether it counts as a zechut or not. But we don't need to enter into that. But what does that make it sound like? Makes it sound like Zachin and shlichut maybe aren't the same thing. They're being brought as separate suggestions, right? The first suggestion of the Gemara is that this pasuk is a source for the din of shlichut. Problem: Tanim are not in shlichut. Answer: new suggestion. Actually, it's coming not to teach us about shlichut, but about Zachin, which should work for a katan. And then, right there ends up being a rejection of that proof as well. But from that sugya in kiddushin. And this becomes the broad stroke shita of all of Chachmei Sfarad. From that sugya in kiddushin, it really seems like Zachin and shlichut, right? Lo karav zel zeh. They seem to be separate principles that operate separately. That it makes sense according to the Gemara that even though shlichut doesn't work for a katan, Zachin still would, and that all of this is operating on the Doraita level, right? We're wondering about psukim from the Torah that teach us about this din 1 versus din 2. So that's where the Rashba ends up. Why the Rashba? He says it almost most clearly out of the Chachmei Sfarad. Mehad de'amre v'tisbra dehashlichutu im kein matzinu shlichut lekatan v'amrinan ela kihad Rav Arafuna Rav Gidol Amarav minayin shezakin ladam shelo b'fanav. From this sugya, mashma says the Rashba de'zichia lad midin shlichutu. That zichia is actually not a subcategory of shlichut, but that it's something else, and that it works according to different rules and operates according to different principles. And then he ends up having to sort out a different sugya in a different sugya, but that's for another time. So right, the Rashba, and it seems to be a very compelling read in our sugya, right? That we have right on the one hand, right, shlichut as an option wouldn't work for katan, and therefore we're suggesting another option. So the Rashba's understanding from this is that Zachin and shlichut are actually two different categories. So here, just conceptually, right, we have the read of the Rashba and the read of Tosafot, and how it kind of plays out in the different sugyot. Um, so Zachin, according to, let's look at Tosafot first, actually, even though it's second on the slide, right? That a child can't appoint a shaliach, which seems to be a problem because a problem for the idea that Zachin works for a katan because Zachin is really just shlichut without the minui. Zachin really just is shlichut that works without the minui. Whereas according to the Rashba, um, the fact that Zachin works for a katan, whereas shlichut does not work for katan, isn't a problem at all because Zachin is just this totally new mechanism that doesn't really operate according to the principles of shlichut at all. It's a separate thing. According to Tosafot, the logic behind Zachin, right? If we understand Zachin as a kind of subcategory of shlichut, right? Once we understand shlichut, the logic behind Zachin is the same logic, and the fact that it works without a minui, why does it work that? Via anan sahade, via this idea that like there's um, implicitly understood consent by everyone. Whereas according to the Rashba, right, the Rashba wants to say it's a different deen. He doesn't really give us that much to tell in terms of what conceptually that deen is, right? That's why on some level there's logical or conceptual payoff to making Tosafot's jump and understanding Zachin as a subcategory. According to the Rashba, Zachin is Doraita. According to Tosafot, Zachin, at least when it comes to a child, as Mita Rabbanan. And we saw that he at least entertained the possibility in our second Batra that according to Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Zachin is entirely derived. Now the question is going to be, what does Tosafot? How would Tosafot have to read the sugya in Ketubot? The sugya in Kiddushin in order to make it make sense with his understanding of Zachin as with Zachin as a subcategory of shlichut, right? We saw that there are these two suggestions that the Gemara gives, right? The first, minayin shezachin l'adam shelo b'fanav, and the second, that the first that minayin shlichut shel adam kamota minayin, and the second that minayin shezachin l'adam shelo b'fanav. So what is Tosafot going to have to do? Tosafot is going to have to re-understand the relationship between those two suggestions that the Gemara makes. So, right, the way that we understood it, broad strokes, was that there's one suggestion. What do we learn from this pasuk? There's a problem, so we offer a new suggestion that is separate. But maybe what Tosafot is going to have to do is understand the second suggestion not really as a new suggestion, but as a sort of emendation of the first suggestion, right? If we understand the first option is right, the minayin sheshlu kol shel adam k'moto. Oh, but that doesn't really work because there can't be minui because there was a katan. So maybe, right, that if we understand that Zachin is a subcategory of shlichut, it's not a totally new suggestion, but an emendation of the first. Not shlichut doesn't work, but Zachin does, but rather shlichut we thought couldn't work because there was a katan involved. But maybe there's but maybe right shlichut bona fide shlichut greda doesn't work because there are katanim involved. But what's the kind of shlichut that we know a katan can do? Zachin. So maybe the mechanism wasn't the mechanism of shlichut, but the result was the result of someone else can do something for me. Maybe that was possible despite the fact that shlichut or that minui shaliach wasn't possible, and it was possible via the operation of zachin, which can work even for a katan, as we saw in that other sugya. And that allowed for the quote unquote appointment of someone of these nesiim to do something on behalf of the Am. So Tosafot would really have to read the sugya differently. What we can see here is that these kind of fundamentally conceptually different understandings have ramifications in how these rishonim are going to read the text. And that's going to take place all over Shas, right? Tosafot's broad understanding of Zachin as a subset of shlichut is going to cause him problems according to the sugya that think that Zachin is possible with a katan, but then therefore he's going to have to explain the way that this deen and his understanding of it fit into the text of the various sugya. Thanks so much, and see you next week.